Hello and welcome. My name is David Saunders. I'm a curator here at the Getty Villa in Los Angeles, California, home to the Getty's collection of ancient Greek, Roman, and Etruscan art. Before starting today, we'd like to acknowledge that the land that the Getty inhabits today was once known as Tobangar, the home of the Gabrielino Tongva people. We show our respects to the Gabrielino Tongva people, as well as all First People, past, present, and future, and honor their labor as original caretakers of this land. The Getty commits to building relationships with the Gabrielino Tongva community, and we invite you to acknowledge the history of this land and join us in caring for it. Today's programme complements our current exhibition here at the Getty Villa, Picture Worlds, Greek, Maya, and Moche Pottery. I'd have the next slide, please. This exhibition has been running since April. It has just 1 month left here at the Getty Villa and brings together the painted pottery of three distinct and separate traditions. If I could show the next slide. The Greeks in the Mediterranean between around 700 and 323 BCE, the Maya in Central America we're focusing between around 550 to 850 CE, and the Moche, a people or peoples in northern Peru, between around 200 and 850 CE. These are three cultures that have no trace of contact or interaction. As you can see, they are scattered across the globe, flourishing at different distinct time periods. There is no trace of, as I say, interaction. But each of them stands out for their painted ceramics, for their vessels made of clay that were adorned and decorated with complex scenes of narrative imagery, representations of gods, of heroes, of ritual activities, and legendary events. And in this exhibition, for the first time as a major museum display, we are bringing these three cultures together, really to see what happens when we bring these three cultures together in a shared space, the ideas and opportunities that they engender for us to explore more deeply in terms of traditions of image making and storytelling and the sort of social setting in which images and stories can circulate. And today's session is sort of an attempt at that kind of in miniature, in which we focus on three individual vessels in the exhibition. In order to do that, I am delighted to welcome our speakers today. First, I should introduce Megan O'Neill. Megan is the co-curator of the exhibition and also co-editor of the accompanying publication. Megan is Associate Professor of Art History at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, specializing in ancient Maya sculpture, painting, ceramics, and material culture. Megan and I have worked on this exhibition, I think, approaching 5 years now, Megan. So it is a real pleasure and honor to be able to share the virtual stage with Megan and to celebrate and mark our collaboration. I should note too that the exhibition, once it closes here in Los Angeles, travels to the Michael C. Carlos Museum in Atlanta, opening on September the 14th, and Megan is deeply immersed in preparing the second installation of the show there. Megan and I are joined by two esteemed colleagues who have not only contributed to the publication, but in the development of this whole project, providing us with really great feedback and suggestions as we've shaped the project, selected objects for the installation. And again, I'm thrilled that we are able to be joined by them today. First, Guy Hedreen, who is the Amos Lawrence Professor of Art at Williams College. Guy is interested in the influence of religion, poetry, narrative, and social history on Greek art and has received several honors, such as the Guggenheim Fellowship, the Rome Prize Fellowship, the NEH Fellowship, and the Clark Fellowship. And his recent research delves into relationships between Dionysus, satyrs, sexuality, and gender. And joining us from Peru, in Lima, Julio Rucabado, the curator of pre-Columbian art at the Museo de Arte de Lima. Julio is interested in Moche iconography, power, politics, and ancient Peru. He served as co-director of the San Jose de Moro archaeological project, where his research addressed the collapse and reorganization of the societies of Hecatepeque during the transitional period. He also explores connections between the Moche and other societies, as well as relationships between the coastal and mountain regions of the Moche state. In short, you could not have a more engaging and enriching group of scholars to spend the next hour or so with. And I say I'm delighted that they have been able to make the time and for their enthusiasm and willingness to participate today. The way that the session is going to run is that each speaker will present a single vessel for around 7 minutes, and we hope that that then stimulates what follows, which is a discussion amongst the three of them. Megan, Julio, and Guy will also be open to responding to all of your questions towards the end of today's program. With that, I'm going to elegantly try to disappear and hand the baton over to Megan.
Thank you so much, David, and everyone for having me here today. And I just want to publicly thank David Saunders for being such a wonderful collaborator. And I'm excited for the conversation with Julio and Guy. So I am going to talk about, next, right? I am going to talk about this Maya cylinder vessel that was likely made around 600 to 700 CE, possibly in El Sots in Petén, Guatemala. Today, it's in the Princeton University Art Museum collection. And I want to talk about the portrayal of time and its passage on this vase and in the experience of handling the vessel. Just want to also thank Brian Just, the curator at the Princeton Art Museum, who's published about this piece, and to Princeton Museum for lending us this wonderful piece to the exhibition. Next. Late classic Maya artists told stories through images in diverse ways. The maize god, you see on the screen, often appears alone in a key moment of a cyclical narrative involving his death and rebirth, as on this vessel showing his rebirth, which was found in a tomb in Calakmul, Mexico. Next slide. Or we can see multiple episodes of the narrative. This mural from San Bartolo shows 3 scenes in one, right to left. The maize god diving into water, or his death, dancing inside the turtle earth, and reborn as an infant on the left. These are foundational stories for the ancestral Maya and Maya people today. Next slide. Now, like the San Bartolo mural, this vessel is multi-episodic, showing the maize god at different ages of life. It also conveys the passage of time, both within each scene and across them, given the maize god's different ages as an infant, youth, and adult. Next. As on many Maya vessels, there are different registers of information. A dedicatory inscription encircles the rim, stating it is a drinking vessel for chocolate and functioning independently from the other inscriptions and images. Next. The 3 scenes each have inscriptions quoting speech or identifying figures. For instance, naming Hunpu, possibly a correlate of Hunapu in the Quiche Maya Popol Vuh. Now, figures' heads or body movements or glances appear to connect the scenes or encourage a user to turn the cylinder. Next. In one scene, a spotted figure, who's Hunpu, faces a reptilian creature, possibly a turtle, with a stone on its head and carrying a large travel or merchant pack. Gourds for water hang from the pack. Next slide. And midway up is the baby maize god seated in a bowl. Next, between them is a caption with speech. As Matthew Luper and Yuri Polyukovich have deciphered, it says 8,000 is his cargo, referring to the pack, possibly carried as tribute. And note that the baby maize god looks to the right, next slide, to an adjacent scene with a young woman holding a young maize god on her back and facing a seated man, next slide, with whom she is in dialogue. Speech scrolls lead from their mouths to the inscriptions. The left inscription is in the second person, saying your, and the right begins with alai, it is said. Now here, the act of speech and the passage of time embedded within that is signaled both by the speech scrolls and by the grammar. Brian Just has suggested that the text and image may relate to this woman being pregnant with the maize god, but that remains unclear. Regardless, there's also movement within this image. Next slide. For the figure standing behind that, the seated figure, is the adult maize god who turns and looks the other direction. Next slide. To the next scene, propelling the user in that direction. He is part of both scenes, and his body twist and glance indicate the passage of time of that very movement. Next slide. In that adjacent scene, a small figure, you'll see at the bottom, presents two birds, a quetzal and a parrot, to the aged creator deity Itzam Kokah Balam, who's seated on a jaguar pelt-covered throne and reaching towards the parrot. Their actions, indicated by their hand positions and their verbal communication, signaled by their open mouths, indicate narrative and the passage of time. Next slide. And above are quotations, captions with the old god's speech, which again uses a second person pronoun. This time it says, say, good is your payment, good. And then he said it, Itzam Kokah Balam, thus recording the speech and the speaker. Really remarkable. Next slide. Thus, in each scene are narrative images and captions recording speech that are signaled by speech scrolls, open mouths, quoted phrases, and speaker names. Next slide. So the passage of time is conveyed in individual scenes through the images, inscriptions, and uttered speech, and across the images as one scene leads to the next, part of a longer narrative of sequential episodes that are connected through body positions, directions of faces, and glances, but also through the passage of time implied by having the maize god at different ages. Each of these may even be key events in mini narratives that relate to a larger narrative. Now, the perception and experience of these narratives also depends on the experience of the object. Now, as you can see, the shape allows you to see most, but not all, of each scene, and one has to turn the cylinder to see the rest. But once you do that, you see part of another, and you need to turn more. Next slide. Catherine Burdick suggested that the narrative goes left to right if one follows the maize god's increasing age. But Brian Just has argued it goes the other way. And indeed, it can do both. One following the maize god's age and glances left to right. Next slide. But note that the traveling turtle walks towards the offering scene to Itzam Kokah, perhaps carrying that tribute for the old god too, mirroring what that small figure is presenting to the old god. And indeed, that rendering of Itzam Kokah takes up the most space on the vessel, suggesting that the subject of tribute to him is the most important, and all other scenes direct to him. Thus, the image's inscriptions urge a user to not just turn the vessel one way, but to turn it back and forth, to both see and actualize the movement of the narrative through and over time. Next slide. Thank you. I will now turn it over to Guy for his presentation.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you also for inviting me to participate in this discussion, and thank you to David Saunders for that as well. I'm going to talk about a single Athenian red figure vase in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. It is a large skyphos, or bowl for drinking wine. It was made around 480 BC, and it is signed by a painter who calls himself Macron. And I'm really delighted to be presenting this vase after Megan's presentation, because this vase also tells the story of a single individual through multiple episodes and invites us to consider the story backward and forward. Okay, so let's begin with a brief description. On this side of the vase, at the far left, you see a young warrior striding to the left. Behind him, another warrior follows. This warrior leads a woman by the wrist, as if he were taking her away with him. Her unmoving feet perhaps express a certain reluctance to go along. To the right, a second woman adjusts the veil or headscarf of the one being taken away. A third woman is present even further around to the right. Fluttering in the air, in the middle of the picture, is a little winged boy, Eros, the god of desire, better known today as Cupid, making the woman irresistible to the man who is leading her away. The painter has written the names of these figures on the vase in added red paint, and you can perhaps just see some of these letters near the heads of the figures. The young man on the far left is the Trojan warrior Aeneas. The man leading the woman by the wrist is Paris. That is Paris of Troy. The woman he leads away is Helen. You know, the woman whose face launched 1,000 ships. Next comes the goddess of love herself, Aphrodite. And behind her, on the far right, the last figure is Peitho, the goddess of persuasion, who appears to have successfully persuaded Helen to go along with Paris. Okay, next slide, please. On the other side of the vase, we see Helen again in the center of the picture. Here, the letters spelling out her name are pretty easy for you to see. Her first husband, Menelaus, is rushing toward her from the right. He is drawing his sword as if he intends to kill her. Helen turns to flee. Aphrodite appears once again, just as before, to help Helen adjust her veil or headscarf. And then to the far left are two additional figures, Trojan allies, a father and a daughter, Chryseis and Chryses. Okay, the great scholar of Athenian vase painting, J.D. Beasley, wrote the following about this vase. Quote, "The theme of the vase is Helen, at two crises in her life. On one side, she follows Paris. On the other, after Troy is taken, she flees from Menelaus. Between these two moments, there has been the Trojan War." End quote. Next slide, please. Anyone looking at this vase in antiquity is likely to know this story, and so is likely to know that 10 years have passed between what is shown on one side and what is shown on the other. A lot of water under the bridge. So what is the effect of pushing together, juxtaposing on this one vase two temporally distant scenes in proximity to each other on a single vase, the way it's done here? Well, the effect is to create a theme for the entire decoration of the vase that is larger than just any one episode. Namely, Helen. What happened to her? Why did her story turn out the way that it did? Next slide, please. Emphasizing this is the fact that Helen is the one mortal figure to appear on both sides of this vase. This vase uses repetition in other ways to highlight certain causal factors or causal forces in Helen's life story. So the goddess Aphrodite also appears twice on this vase. Next slide, please. Notice how Aphrodite plays the same role in each picture. She's not merely fiddling with Helen's veil, she is making Helen beautiful, attractive, irresistible to men. The appearance of Aphrodite in identical form on each side of this vase also has the effect of suggesting that certain actions occur again and again in Helen's life, as if time were cyclical. Next slide, please. Some of these points are emphasized as well by the presence of a different man in each picture who physically handles or threatens Helen. On the one hand, the men seem interchangeable. They come and they go, whereas Helen remains the center of attention. On the other hand, the men remind us that Helen has very little agency of her own. And so through the way in which this vase is constructed, we get a lot of ideas about how to understand Helen and what happened to her. Okay, next slide, please. This complex pictorial narrative of the life of Helen is made even more dynamic by one additional feature. There is a single figure under each handle of this vase. Under one handle, what you see here, there is a young boy being left behind as Helen is led away by Paris. The boy is not named, but the situation strongly suggests that it is Helen's child. Next slide, please. Under the other handle, old King Priam of Troy is seated at home. Next slide, please. These two underhandle figures add additional meaning to the visual narrative that runs around this vase. One is the cost to mortals of the actions of Helen, the men, and the goddess Aphrodite. Helen's son loses his mother. Priam loses everything. Another idea is the cycle of, there's a sense of the cycle of human life here, from innocent childhood before the complications of sexuality to old age and impotence of every sort. But these two underhandle figures also serve to indicate the spatial settings of our two scenes. The child is at home in Sparta. So Paris is leading Helen away from her home and towards Priam, towards Troy, that is. Priam is at home in Troy, where Paris brought Helen and from which she never strayed until Menelaus found her there on the last night of Troy. In the end, he did not kill her, but brought her back to Sparta again. So the movement of the figures is cyclical, from Sparta to Troy to Sparta again, like the passage of time in this story, and like the shape of the vase itself, which we are encouraged to turn in our hands over and over to follow the story of Helen. So thank you very much. And now over to you, Julio.
Thank you, Guy. And also thank you, Dave and Megan, for inviting me to participate in this event. In the past 3 decades, scholars have proved that Moche visual art has a narrative structure, and most, if not all, the images correspond to a complex mythological discourse. Today, I'm presenting this Moche vessel, a 14-year-old bottle from the north coast of ancient Peru, which is included in the exhibition Picture Worlds. This ceremonial container was fully decorated from top to bottom with fine line painted motifs. This type of vessel and the painting style relates to the Jequetepeque Valley, one of the regions where Moche state formation occurred between the 7th and the 8th century of the Common Era. This vessel, by the way, is now at the Fowler Museum collection. There are at least 17 similar vessels depicting what Chris Donnan in 1979 named the burial theme. Most of these vessels belong to the Jequetepeque region and were probably found at the elite cemetery and regional center of San Jose de Moro, where Luis Jaime Castillo and his crew work since 1990s. Next please. In terms of what we should read in these vessels, Donnan identified 4 activities which cover different areas of the vessel's body. He also noticed the presence of a double line that in this drawing is red, is remarked with a red color, which separates the activities, although he was not able to reconstruct the chronological sequence in which the 4 activities took place. Next, the image depicted in this bottle mostly correspond to the final episodes of a complex mythical narrative in which the main character, a heroic figure, a feline man, known as Wrinkle Face or Ayapike, among many other names, restores order in the Moche world. He is the one who finds and releases the sun from its prison in the underworld. He also brings rain, and later on, as we will see in this particular vessel, he is involved in the sacrifice and burial of the Moche moon goddess. Let's see the sequence of 4 or 5 of different but temporarily related scenes in this painted bottle, from the moon sacrifice and the bird hunting to the moon's burial and the funeral assembly, and finally the conch shell transfer. First, the moon sacrifice. Next. Here, we clearly recognize a female body, completely naked and with a shaved head. The moon usually wears a long tunic and a headdress. She's also distinguished by her long braided hair. However, in this critical situation, a sacrifice, as it usually happens also to male prisoners prepared for sacrifice, she is stripped of her clothes, loses her hair, and her body is devoured by carrion birds. In at least 2 other vessels, like the one down in the right corner, she is depicted with braids and fangs in her mouth, a common attribute among the supernatural figures in Moche art. Next. Next to this scene stands the wrinkled face, letter A, handling spears and a spear thrower. He usually uses these weapons when hunting deer, but here he hunts birds. An anthropomorphized spear, letter B, is bringing to him a group of birds tied with a rope. One of these birds is hanging on a rack, letter D, possibly as a sacrifice. Below wrinkled face, there's a frog, letter E, a 3-dimensional and painted frog standing at the edge of the hole. The hole is part of an internal tube that crosses the vessel's body at the equator line. But why is the frog going to jump into this hole? We will address this question by the end. Next. On the other side, the opposite side of the bottle, if you spin the bottle, you will see this. And it happens the burial event. There, wrinkled face and the anthropomorphized iguana, letter A and B, lower a casket into a funerary chamber. The casket is surrounded by many offerings, including bowls, miniature vessels, a bird, and also a conch shell. The casket also shows a mask attached to one of its sides. Many details shown in previous scenes suggest that the corpse inside the casket possibly correspond to the moon previously sacrificed. Next to the burial, there's a funeral assembly. The participants are arranged in 2 lines, standing at both sides of the grave pit. To the left, we recognize 2 lines of moon figures, letter C. In front of them, to the right, there are 2 lines of hybrid creatures, letter D and E, feline man at the top and deer man at the bottom. Behind the moon figures stands the anthropomorphized iguana as letter B, carrying a rattle in his hands. In most versions of the burial theme, both the iguana and wrinkled face play rattles, although wrinkled face is absent in this particular version, playing rattles as musicians in a funeral procession. Next, the conch shell transfer probably correspond to an episode that predates the previous scenes I described. A character named as the kneeler, seated on top of a platform structure, letter A, received conch shells from the anthropomorphized iguana, letter B, and the moon, letter C. One of the 17 vessels in the burial event theme series is the one we have in this slide. It's the one that apparently comes from the Chicama Valley, south from the Jequetepeque, and shows what should be considered the original version of the burial theme. There we recognize that the kneeler in the section belonging to the conch shell transfer, the kneeler, letter A, received the shells from Wrinkled Face and the anthropomorphized iguana. In this case, the moon is absent, and there's only a group of women seated below the platform, but they show no supernatural attributes. They are real women. Next, a similar situation is observed in a different vessel from the Larco Museum that is also included in this exhibition. In this scene, we clearly recognize that the position of the kneeler is taken by the owl, the lord of the night, and Wrinkled Face in front of him, and the iguana delivering the shells. In this vessel, the moon again is absent. Next. Another burial theme vessel shows a birdman and the moon on top of the platform receiving the shells, letter A and B in this case. In this particular scene, the moon delivers the shells with the iguana, and below the platform, there's also a line of 4 similar moon figures. So there's a duplicity of the moon figure that we can discuss later. Going back to our vessel, the one we are describing today, we see that also it has decoration at the bottom surface. We identify the figure of a birdman, possibly a local version of the owl god. If you look carefully to both figures, please return, please. If you look carefully to both figures, you will notice that both of the figures have a similar headdress. Next. Finally, why did the frog jump into the hole? That is the question, the starting question. Frogs relate with humid places and the rainfall season. They are references of fertility, and during El Nino, frogs are abundant in the northern coast. Some sculptural vessels show frogs with plants coming out of their bodies, like these 2 cases. Also, transformed into a feline, Wrinkled Face, the hero, meets a frog and have sexual intercourse. When this happens, plants begin to grow in the feline's body, as if he is capturing the energy or the essence of the frog. The feline shapeshift, and that's very common in his persona. The feline shapeshift and assume some of the frog's attributes, especially limbs, mouth, and the frog's fertility. From its body emerge different plants: corn, beans, manioc, and chili pepper. Some sculptural vessels show Wrinkled Face, like the ones to the right, shows Wrinkled Face head with a plant body, reinforcing his nature as a hero also related to fertility. In this scene, we recognize Wrinkled Face and a female figure, probably the moon, having sexual intercourse, and from their bodies emerged a tree. This image may suggest that the animal alter ego of the moon is actually the frog. So why did the frog jump into the hole? After the sun returns, and this is a summary of narrative in a way, after the sun returns, the moon is sacrificed and her body is prepared for visiting the underworld. Many burial theme images show little dots all over the surface of the bottle. Some scholars have proposed that these are elements used by the Moche painter as fillers, creating a sort of Baroque aesthetic. However, these little dots that unfortunately are not depicted in this rollout version, probably they may represent water or raindrops. many of them usually on top of the grave pit. So the burial scene, in a way, marks the end and the beginning of a new cycle, a natural cycle, which was symbolized in a way by a cute little frog jumping into the hole, probably at the end of the rainy season in the desertic northern coast of Peru. Thank you so much. I just invite Megan and Guy to start a discussion.
Yes, thanks to both of you. Those were really wonderful, and I love looking at these images closely on my screen. I want to start with a question. I've just, as you all were speaking, was thinking about clarity, obfuscation, subtlety, ambiguity, longer looking, physical experiences of things. And it brought me back to something that Guy said when we were sort of emailing about our presentations. And he said, if communication were the primary goal, then pots would not be the best medium. So I want to ask, why ceramic vessels? Why pots? What do they bring? I don't know if one of you wants to take on that question.
Sure, I will start because in order to save time, I did not discuss the context in which a vase like this bowl would have been used, and I think it's worth mentioning that. These vases were designed to be used at drinking parties, and we know a lot about how drinking parties in antiquity were organized. It's not just like going to a bar. They're a bit more formalized than that, and there is a lot of singing of poetry, recitation of poems, telling jokes, and there's a certain amount of, there's a lot of back and forth around the room, right? And there usually would be a relatively small number of people all drinking, each person having a cup. And these cups make sense in the context of a lively, interactive, dynamic discussion group where they can serve as prompts for not just telling a story, but then asking a question about it or discussing it. So this vase is not designed to tell the story of Helen to anyone who doesn't know it. If you don't know the story, there is no way you're going to figure it out from this vase. But it is designed for a group of people who do know the story, and they ought to be able to puzzle it out. So I would be actually curious to ask both of you, how you think these vases were used, and also how widely known you think these stories were to the people using the vases, or how esoteric they were.
Well, in the case, thanks for the question, Megan, and all the insights from Guy. In the case of the Northern Coast and the historical and cultural context related with the production and the use of these type of vessels, I have to say that the discourse have to do with the political ideology that also was represented in other media, mainly in ceramics, that's true, but also we found very similar discourse in the mural temples. But there's a major difference between a pot and a mural, no? The mural was produced to be seen by many people in open public spaces, and these vessels probably by a small crew, no, small in a different venue. However, also the nature of the objects have to consider that probably 90% or more of this vessel at the end finished as a funerary offering. Most of these vessels have no traces of use. So in some cases, they were produced to be an offering and then go with the dead into the underworld. I mean, to probably there's a connection probably, or the function of communication have to do not between humans, but between humans and society and the dead. Because ancient Peruvians, as the chroniclers mentioned in the 16th century, especially in the northern coast of Peru, believed that people continue their lives in what we call the afterlife, continue doing their duties, being the chief or peasants or working in different ways. So they need to drink, they need to eat, but they need to remember, of course, the connection with the supernaturals. And on the other hand, there are some vessels that have traces at the bottom, at the base. So that means that they were taken and from surfaces and moved once and many times, or bases for drinking have traces of use at the edge for drinking. But the other thing that need to be considered is that these type of vessels, that we call them bottles because are closed containers with a handle and a vertical spout that are hollow completely inside, are really difficult to use. They're not very practical. I mean, you can fill it with water, but when you need to pour, if you want to serve water to another container, it's really difficult. And when we excavate household areas, bottles, the Moche bottles, are completely different. Usually you have a vertical spout that are more efficient. It's more efficient than this system, this particular system. So all these factors help us to reconstruct in a way, who is communicating, what is communicated, and why is communicated. I don't know if that answered a little bit the question, Megan.
Yeah, it really does. Thanks to both of you for that. And for the Maya, we know that vessels like this were used in court settings. They were given as gifts between kingdoms, between individuals, or inside courts and across different kingdoms. So their portability was really important. Also, as with both of you all, the fact that they were potentially used for eating and drinking, and they were also, of course, offered to the ancestors in tombs as well. But I'm really struck with all of our pieces about how this kind of moments of repetition that propel narrative forward and sort of help you see, or also moments of deletion or ambiguity that sort of make it so you have to have a conversation, right? You have to move it, you have to experience that. And as I was looking, Guy, as you were showing your vessel, it was so striking. And I don't know if we want to go to slide, I think it was 23, where we really see that Helen's dress becomes so much more diaphanous in one of those scenes where we really see her body and that sexuality. So there where we have sort of an extra detail that maybe you don't know why it's there, but there's going to be this sort of influence, like if you're really looking closely.
Well, the one comment I'm going to make, Megan, about what you just said is that I think the depiction of the story on this particular vase is particularly subtle because unlike other vases, it does not tell you that Menelaus is he's going to drop his resolve to kill his wife, and he's going to take her back home again. Of course, everybody knows that. I mean, if you know this story at all, then you'll know that Menelaus and Helen end up at home together, and living together after the Trojan War. But the pot leaves the ending open. So I think it's an example of one of the things that you're talking about. I think this is a really good example. And Helen is very uncertain about the likelihood that this is going to turn out well, because she doesn't just stand in front of her husband, revealing her beauty to him. She turns to run. Her beauty is revealed, you might say, through that diaphanous clothing, but she's not deliberately doing that. Her intention seems to be to get away. So I think you're right. This is where well, I say the word fun, but I think it's more than just fun. This is what made these vases worth talking about. I think for a bunch of people who know the basic story, and they can now drill in a little bit further. But I do have one question that I would like to follow up with you about your Maya ceramics, and that is, I would like to know how many people can read those inscriptions that you showed us, because the inscriptions that you can see on in the right image here, we know that these vase painters, many of them could write, and presumably they can read, and possibly some of the people who are using the vase can read as well, but they're not really essential to understanding the story. Your inscriptions seem longer, more elaborate, very interesting in the way in which they switch from direct speech to indirect speech to, So I'm curious to know, just you have a sense about the role of language in these ceramics.
Yeah, sure. It's a great question. So if we could go to slide 5, that has all of those, all the sides of this vessel. So literacy in the Maya world, scholars have discussed this, probably fewer than 8 to 10% of people could read inscriptions, and maybe people had different levels of literacy. They could recognize a king's name or but not read absolutely everything. These types of vessels were more of a private medium and a courtly medium, especially with this, I would say, this level of artistry and complexity. Not all Maya vessels are this complex. It's one reason why I picked it for this presentation, because it shows time and narrative in so many different ways. And I would say many of the people within the court who would experience a vessel like this would have been able to enter into the inscriptions or narrative, as opposed to, much more of the population who couldn't, but they may not have seen something like this, right? They might have seen a mural or a monumental stone sculpture where their fewer pieces of the narrative might be shown. I hope that helps. If I could just ask Julio one question, I think it might be almost time for Q&A, but I do want to ask Julio about that amazing hole through that vessel, which also just seems like just sort of the physical nature of this particular vessel. Like, I don't even know how a potter makes something like that, and also how that sort of technical excellence sort of adds to that story. And I've got to ask, like, is that also the moon's vagina? I mean, I don't know if I'm going too far in that, but it's just a really extraordinary ceramic technical move. What do you think about that?
Well, these are the result of a tradition of pottery that starts several hundred or 1,000 years before the Moche. But there's something interesting that happens in the Jequetepeque Valley between the 600 and 800, that the potters there start experimenting with different shapes, not only the way they painted the designs that turned to be a kind of Baroque representation, completely dense in the surface, but also doing these vessels with holes. And this one, it just have a single hole that goes from one side to the other. There's another vessel with more than 20 holes, but it's like a double chamber. So there's an inside chamber and then an outside chamber, and full of holes, no? And probably the holes have to do also, they convey certain meaning. In this particular case, it's closely related to the idea of passing into the underworld, to the inner world, the humid world in a way, because inside the vessel, no, you will find some kind of liquids. No, it's a vessel for that. It's a very well crafted that liquids will not spill from the hole. It's completely sealed inside, plus the presence of the froth. No, so there are many other vessels with holes in the middle, and always a frog is very close to the hole. So was part of a narrative probably, but it has been paid little attention to that.
I hate to intrude on this this really rich conversation. It's been really really enjoyable and instructive to hear how these objects and the three of you are responding to them. I'm going to try to transition and see if we can respond to some of the many questions that have been flooding in. And for those of you watching, please do type in any queries you may have in the Q&A, and we will try our best to answer them. One I will just take, which I saw a moment ago, which touches on a number of general themes that have maybe been brushed already. Do you think the stories on these vessels were likely familiar to all in society, even if only certain people could afford such pottery in daily life or in their graves? And maybe that's a question for each of the three of you.
Okay, since no one's speaking up, I'm going to do it first. Stories like this one, which are, some of you may know, it's a story that you read parts of it in the Iliad of Homer, parts of it in the Odyssey of Homer, would have been widely known because those poems were recited by, at this point in time in Athenian life and culture, these poems are being recited by rhapsodes at big public festivals, where lots of people can gather and listen to them. So there's an assumption that a story like the story of Helen is a story that a lot of people would know. More interesting, but I don't want to take up too much time and go into it, is that the pot is found in Etruria, and so many Greek vases with well-known stories from Greek epic poetry end up in Etruscan tombs, and that raises questions about how much the Etruscans knew about these stories, how well they knew them, and scholars don't agree on that. I mean, I happen to think that Etruscans knew the stories very well, and that some of them could read Greek well, but not all my colleagues would agree with that. The vessels mean something different. They're valuable because they're from Athens, or they value them for the way in which they're painting, perhaps the bravura treatment of fabric on this particular vase, but in Greece proper, I think these stories would be pretty broadly known. But it's probably correct that not everyone could afford one of these pots. Over to you, Julio or Megan.
Yeah, I can.
Well,
sorry, go ahead.
Go, Megan. Go, Megan.
Oh, I was just going to say quickly that for the maize god, most people would have known and stories about the maize god. Corn was the staple food, is the staple food, extremely, extremely important. So I think everyone would have known stories of the maize god, and we see images of the maize god in more simply painted vessels and plates. And if you also just understanding, like, we use the word God, but these are manifestations of the actual corn, right? And so an image is another manifestation of the corn in the field. Someone also asked in the Q&A about the life cycle of corn. Yes, absolutely. The young maize, the older maize, death and rebirth. So yes, these would have been commonly known stories.
In the case of the Mochica kit, I'm not quite sure if everybody knew the stories, but we have to say that there's certain characters that came from an ancient tradition, from Kupisnika and Chavin times that were reformulated during Mochica times. So there's like a foundation that probably is shared by many groups in the northern coast. However, at this time, I have to say that while in the Jequetepeque Valley, the painters basically under the direction of the local elite, paint these scenes related to mainly to the figure of the moon goddess, because the most powerful leaders in this particular valley were female. We have found their elite tombs in San Jose de Moro. No, some of them buried with very similar bottles like the one you see in the picture. But at the same time, 200 kilometers south, in a different Moche polity, paintings are slightly different. What I want to say is that you have discourses and counter discourses. That means that, like, you have a major tradition, but then each region developed its own version of the story. So it may change. So what people heard in oral speak or saw in these vessels or murals could be completely different from one valley to the other.
Two questions about animals. Firstly, for Guy, on the Greek vase, the significance of the lion and the bull.
Oh, the lion and the bull. You know, it was customary to put depictions on the outside of your shield. There's some reason to think that the Greeks did this because they thought this is an intimidating thing for your enemy, right? And some shield devices have the mask of Medusa, the Gorgon Medusa, for example. And in the Iliad, we learn that this is considered a terrifying image, you know. And so presumably here, the bull tells you something about Menelaus. I'd like to think it tells you something about his temper at the moment, right? He is very angry. And he waited 10 years for this moment, you know. He's had a lot of time to stew over this. So yeah, but it's not. I guess I would want to emphasize that it's not always easy to say precisely what each one of these shield devices, we call them shield devices, means in each scene. It does not always clear how it connects up with the characters, but it's a typical feature that you would see on a shield.
And secondly, for Julio, one of our correspondents is interested in the depictions of the llama and deer on Moche vessels. This person is a zooarchaeologist and always interested in food strategies. Do we know anything about Moche food and diet?
Yeah, I mean, from what I part of the archaeological research where I participate with Luis Jaime Castillo in the San Jose Moro Archaeological Project, we found different areas where llamas were sacrificed, you know, and llamas were introduced as offerings in many of these tombs. Sometimes you will find only the legs of the llama legs, because probably the rest of the body was eaten as part of the celebrations, no? But in some cases, you'll find complete llamas as offerings in the tombs, as well as you see in the Moche iconography depictions of dead people next to the llamas, no, and both alive, because part of the narrative includes, no, the dead coming back to life, no, and when they return with their animals. So yeah, there's a lot of evidence about the use of llamas, and in some household areas, also the consumption of llamas, of deer, and many other animals too, like guinea pigs, for instance.
I see that we are at the top of the hour. And again, thank you everyone for joining us today. Maybe one last question. Again, I'm sorry we haven't been able to, there's so much to cover with each of these vessels, and it's really, you know, the chance to have this conversation. Maybe one question to wrap things up. Someone asks, what are the top two or any takeaways about stories on vessels that your shared look at three cultures has taught you?
Well, I can jump in. I mean, I think I may have already expressed that the ways of guiding viewers or users, but also limiting them, right? And the sort of ambiguity that can be in images as a ways of encouraging people to look longer and experience longer, and also engage with other people. That's what I've learned over the course of this project. And it's sort of a good lesson for myself too. I don't know, what about you all?
These are prompts for storytelling. They're not texts. They don't tell you a story that you don't know, but they're prompts. And a person could teach you a story that you don't know by talking you through the pot, or you could get into a discussion or maybe even a debate over how a story ended and why it ended in the way it did. So it's a kind of a feedback loop between these objects and the people who use them. And what is really striking to me is to see it in 3 different cultures that are completely unrelated. In my field, at the moment, narratives of less interest than other features of pottery, like ornament and things like that. But seeing these 2 other cultures alongside the Greek reminds me how central narrative is to the painting of pots. And so that was really great for me.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Guy and Megan. And I mean, this kind of experience, meeting and share, different views and approach, but at the same time, shows that we are in the very same path. I mean, we are dealing with objects that are silent. No, we are trying to make them speak. No,
Yeah.
and they do not speak for themselves. They never speak for themselves. We are recreating some stories or narratives. In some cases, we have text, and I thought that having the text was great, but now I learned that sometimes you have text, but not necessarily that connection. No, you need a text with illustrations that connect the text with the illustration. And of course, in the other hand, you have these glyphs, Maya glyphs, that are something that in the Andes we have missed. But I think Guy, Megan, and many art historians, and I include myself, I'm an archaeologist, but I have learned a lot in all these decades from art historians that we have to learn to read these details and recreate sequences, recreate actions, but also with helping ourselves with information that comes from history or archaeology. The conjunction of the different disciplines at the end will help us to unreveal many of the still unknown narratives in the 3 different societies and many others that we have.
Yeah, and I absolutely endorse that what you said about these objects don't speak for themselves. And I think one thing that we wanted to do with this exhibition and with today's session is really just to demonstrate, the value of bringing as many different perspectives and voices in. And again, your discussions of these 3 vessels and the incredibly rich conversation that has been going on in the Q&A and in the chat has really sort of demonstrated the value of that enterprise. And so I'd very much like to thank all of you who have been watching for joining us today and for your insightful questions. And to encourage you, if you haven't yet, or if you already have, to come back to see the exhibition here at the Getty Villa. It runs until the 29th of July. And then it will travel to the Michael C. Carlos Museum in Atlanta, Georgia, opening on September the 14th and running until December 15th. Finally, I would like very much to thank Megan, Guy, and Julio for everything they have put into preparing these presentations and for such an enriching conversation. It has been a real joy to work with them and to listen to and to watch. And with that, I would like to wish you all a pleasant and enjoyable rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for all our audience today.
Yeah, thank you. That's right.